the aspect of investing that I like the most. And I think that's the psychology. And as you described, the incredible sort of run up and bubble, the way that sort of crowd psychology works in investment is that people feed off each other and get more and more excited and drive things to short-term extremes. And then when those extremes are reached, the pendulum doesn't just swing back slowly towards the middle and sort of track the growth of the industry in a reasonable way. It overshoots. It goes way too bearish, way too fearful. People completely give up on it. And it's been a sort of microcosm of an investment cycle with cannabis in the last 5 years of massive exuberance, a peak, a crash, and then a complete sort of lack of interest and ignorance. And that is where the opportunity lies. And I think the way that crowds do drive markets in that way is so interesting. And if you can be contrarian, if you can be counter-cyclical in that way, the opportunities.
Welcome to the Exponential Investor Podcast. Want to be a better, smarter, more clued up investor? Well, you've come to the right place. We cover the breakthrough investment ideas you don't hear about in the mainstream to keep you on top of the megatrends and opportunities reshaping our world.
Hello and welcome to the Exponential Investor Podcast. I'm Kit Winder and I'm joined by Sam Volkering. Sam, how are you doing?
Hey Kit, good to be with you. Mixing things up a little bit. Usually it's me kicking things off, but nice to bring a bit of variety to our Friday morning podcast.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I'm sick of you putting me on the spot, and so I thought we'd turn the tables today. And I wanted to ask you that the news came through today, and it kind of caught me out because the news was that the German government is actually forming a coalition, and it had been so long since the election that I'd kind of switched off and forgotten that they hadn't already. But I was wondering, have you been looking into that? Is there anything interesting coming out of this coalition? Anything that investors should be paying attention to?
Yeah, well, I mean, this happened a while ago, isn't it? It's like, and everyone's like, oh, and Angela Merkel's just going to be there forever, right? And it's like, actually, no, it's changing, right? Germany's changing. It's a three-party coalition too. I mean, they thought, when do three-way marriages ever work? Nonetheless, change is coming to Germany. But the really interesting thing, particularly around what I'm looking at with my research at the moment, is this new coalition in Germany, the new leading political rule, is almost certain. You use the word certain flippantly a little bit, but they're very keen on passing legislation that is going to legalize the recreational use of cannabis in Germany. So I mean, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, obviously, but that's sort of the overarching result out of this, is that Germany is going to pretty much follow Canada in terms of having a fully fledged, legalized, collecting taxes and, all the things that governments do on, already do on things like alcohol and petrol and cigarettes and all that sort of stuff. They're going to do on the recreational cannabis market. So they'll have, this thriving medicinal cannabis opportunity, and they'll also have what would appear to be a pretty serious move into opening up the doors for all the potential of the recreational cannabis, which in Germany is surprising. I must admit, it's probably not the first country you'd think of when you think, okay, in the European area, including the UK, what country is going to sort of open the doors to recreational use cannabis as a legal industry? Germany wasn't high on that list, but here we are. Very progressive, and the great beer drinking nation of Germany may very, very soon become the great cannabis consumption market as well, which is huge for the whole of Europe. Really, I think there's not a lot being said about it in the mainstream media, but I think it's huge. I think it's really big for the European cannabis scene.
Well, Sam, there were two things I wanted to follow up on there, but you just mentioned the third. The first, could you just quickly outline who the coalition is roughly between and what we, the sort of the basic tenets of it? And then the second question I had was, you said the mainstream media aren't talking about it, and there's a lot to get into there about how there was a cannabis thing a few years ago. I got super excited about it. and sort of the investment opportunities of picking up after a bubble has burst, I guess, is the conversation here,
Yeah.
and why the market or the mainstream media overlook certain things once they feel that they're past, and that's why there's an opportunity for us maybe.
Yeah, so I want to get this right. So I've just pulled it up on my screen. But the new government brings together Olaf Scholz's left Social Democrats, the SPD, the pro-business Free Democrats, and the German Greens. So they're the three parties that are coming together to form this new coalition. And so yeah, look, what's interesting is you're right about the cannabis market, or cannabis stocks market, if you will, volatile to say the least. What the market tends to do is it tends to run pretty hard on major legislative change. So I can't remember what year it was. It was 2016 or 2017? The US legalized recreational cannabis use a bunch across the states. Canada obviously passed legislation as well, legalizing cannabis. So when you get these major economies passing legislation, should point out the US hasn't federally passed it. It's a sort of state by state thing, but most US states have opened the doors to this and moving towards full legal recreational use. So those things. So Canada and the US certainly saw the market hype and pump pretty hard, to be honest, because the thought was a fully fledged cannabis market, both medicinally and recreationally, would almost be like the alcohol and cigarettes market, which is a fair relationship to sort of tie to. Because what people sort of don't quite understand is I guess cannabis market has a bit of a PR image, right? A bad PR image in terms of most people, and I get this right. So I was at a conference 2 weeks ago, chairing a few panels. The conference was Cannabis Europa, and it was talking with market leaders and industry leaders about the cannabis industry and how it's growing, where the opportunities exist. And I caught up with somebody just before I'd actually gone to host a couple of these panels, and I said that I was heading off to this cannabis conference, and their first reaction was, "Oh, have you packed a couple of spliffs in your pocket?" I'm just like, the understanding and awareness of what this industry is actually all about is really poor by most people. They just think it's a bunch of potheads, trying to sell, rolled up joints to people in the street. Whereas that couldn't be further from the truth about what this market's all about. There's great amounts of scientific research going into the therapeutic use of cannabis, both the CBD side of things and the psychoactive THC side of things, the chemical compounds within cannabis. There's a burgeoning market around fast-moving consumer goods, everything from makeup and wellness goods and services and products to beverages and consumables, food consumables like gummies and a whole bunch of other, as I say, different fast-moving consumer goods, FMCG. So there's so much happening in this space, but most people just think of it as a bunch of stoners, and it's frustrating in that sense, because the market tends to look at it that way as well, and investors look at the market that way as well. Whereas in reality, the development, the research, the scientific proof behind a lot of this, then the expanding world around it, around the recreational side of things. We're talking about a really big, fast-growing industry that sometimes the market gets ahead of it, and then, as you say, it's certainly come off in the last few years. But I think when you push the boat out and look long term at what this is all about and how this can impact people's lives from a medicinal perspective, and even on the recreational side of things, I think there's a great deal of change happening, and it's an industry that, like we've seen before, it kind of does track that hype cycle. And I think we've sort of come out of that, when the hype cycle peaks and then drops, and there's that real big dip off the drop, and then you see that sort of longer term sustained growth. I think we've gone past that dip now, and I think now with countries like Germany starting to open their doors, and I think we'll see more of it across Europe as Germany kind of sets the scene for how this can be done well by a very large economy, and I think it'll flow to the UK as well, in a recreational sense, that we're seeing. So, yeah, I think when people understand the market, when they can see really what's happening, there are parallels to be drawn with the crypto market as well, right? About trying to understand properly what's really happening under the hood. The same for the energy markets too. I'm sure you talk to a lot of people, and they just don't quite get what's actually happening, and they just get very sort of superficial information. So, it's good for us to be able to talk about these things and to tell people that, there's a lot more to it than just what you might think you see on the surface from the mainstream media.
Yeah, I mean, the presence of widespread misconceptions is something that you and I both have to deal with, and I think I actually studied the history of the wars on drugs in Central and South America at university as part of my history degree. It's something I've always been interested in. And, the transition towards legalization of cannabis, first of all, and other things later on, seems to me one of the sort of more certain trends for the decades to come, because it makes so much sense in terms of reassessing or starting to properly understand the nature of addiction and the nature of drugs. And I think if people look into it, that's sort of the inevitable conclusion that you come to, is that the history of the war on drugs and the way that things stand today is not for reasons of sort of helping people or doing the right thing. It's grounded in much baser instincts, and has led to very bad outcomes. And I think the mainstream misconception now is that the sort of drugs are bad, or they're dangerous, or they're associated with crime. But if you think that in America, I saw recently a colleague of ours, Dan Denning, over in the States, he shared that a new record was broken in America recently, which is that 100,000 people died from fentanyl, which is a prescribed painkiller. And I recently read the book Empire of Pain by Patrick Rallian Keefe. It just won the Bailey Gifford Book Prize for this year. It's an absolutely outstanding work on Purdue Pharma and the beginnings of the opioid crisis in America, which is a prescription painkiller epidemic that, is like one of the largest killers of people in, the great land of the free America, whose life expectancy, I think, has declined in the last 10 years. It's so bad. So the concept that these incredibly deadly, addictive, aggressive drugs are being not just legalized, but commercially marketed to a population in America, and something like cannabis, which actually might have a lot of beneficial properties, is being outlawed, it doesn't match up. And I think that is something that will get redressed in the years and decades to come, albeit slowly. And the second thing is really the aspect of investing that I like the most, and I think that's the psychology. And as you described, the incredible sort of run up and bubble, the way that sort of crowd psychology works in investment is that people feed off each other and get more and more excited and drive things to short-term extremes. And then when those extremes are reached, the pendulum doesn't just swing back slowly towards the middle and sort of track the growth of the industry in a reasonable way. It overshoots. It goes way too bearish, way too fearful. People completely give up on it. And it's been a sort of microcosm of an investment cycle with cannabis in the last 5 years, of massive exuberance, a peak, a crash, and then a complete sort of lack of interest and ignorance. And that is where the opportunity lies. And I think the way that crowds do drive markets in that way is so interesting. And if you can be contrarian, if you can be counter-cyclical in that way, the opportunities for cannabis are not just huge, they're right now. I mean, there's a few things starting to come out. And the way the capital cycle works is those crashes, they clear out the worst companies, and the ones that survive they're better capitalized, they're more resilient. That they're well managed, because only the well managed companies survive that kind of crash. And so this is a great time, I think, to be looking. You will know, I think it's pretty clear to everyone listening, much more about the technicalities of the industry, about the value chain, about the opportunities in terms of specifics. But in terms of the sort of broad picture, that's definitely how I see it. And it's not a few year trend, it's a multi-decade trend for me.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the European market with this certainly is that it seems to be really building on a sort of gold standard quality over quantity approach to things. So the thing with like Canada and the way they went about it is that they kind of ran before they could walk. In terms of you had these huge amounts of production, and you didn't necessarily have the immediate market that they expected that there would probably be for that. So the market kind of jumped the gun a little bit on that. That doesn't mean to say that a lot of the companies that have come from this, that are big multinational companies listed in Canada and the US, are bad. Some of them are real quality companies, but it just means that the kind of market has now kind of got a bit of a bad smell about it, for lack of a better phrase. The investors kind of look at it and go, "Oh, that bubble's kind of come and gone." They're not really looking at it from this multi-year, multi-decade perspective, where there's a considerable change coming in atmosphere around the use of cannabis medicinally and recreationally. And interesting, you mentioned about the book that you'd read and the opioid crisis, which has clearly become a thing. I even just noticed on Apple Plus, the Apple streaming service, or was it Disney? Maybe it's Disney. I can't remember. It's one of those big new streaming services. There's like a new show called Dope Sick, which is all about, I think, the opioid crisis or big pharma and the way that they knowingly kind of market these very addictive and ultimately deadly drugs to the people in the US in particular. And the research into cannabis, particularly around therapeutic and medicinal use around pain management, pain relief, and a whole bunch of other different potential use cases it's exciting. It's phenomenal stuff, really, when you see how beneficial it can be. And so you've got this entire market of big pharma that is worth an unbelievable amount of wealth that effectively I think is going to radically change as we see things like a TV series on a major streaming channel start to open people's eyes and minds to the fact that this opioid crisis is a serious thing, and that it has to change, and that one of the ways out of that is through new novel approaches to drugs like cannabis. But we don't talk about it in the terms of drugs like we do heroin. It is not the same as something like heroin. We're talking about it in terms of drugs, as in the potential to help people manage disease and illness and live more comfortable, but healthier lifestyles. So that's just one aspect of it. And so, what we're seeing with Germany, the German market, there's other production centers around Europe. The European market is really starting to flourish and to grow. And I think we're going to see, I think 2022 should be an interesting year again for cannabis companies, particularly in the UK, listing in the UK and in Europe. And so it's certainly an area of focus. I've never really dropped. I've been looking at this market for probably the last 5 years now, almost 6 years, because it's starting to branch out to Australia and Asia, and as I say, Europe and the US and Canada are sort of well down that track as well. And there's just so many facets to it. It's such an interesting and exciting area. Once you kind of open your mind and break past that whole couple of spliffs in my pocket kind of nonsense. So I think once people get their head around that and realize that it's, there's so much more to it, then, we'll all be better off for it. So yeah, it's an exciting sector. What's happening in Germany is really going to give us a good guideline as to how Europe and the UK and this whole region over here can really utilize this as a major market opportunity.
Yeah, on the German stuff, I mean, the final point for me is that it's just great to see a Green Party getting into a coalition of a major developed economy. And,
It's true.
I know Nicola Sturgeon took a couple of Green Party members of Parliament into her cabinet, I think, and she said it wasn't a coalition, but they were just sort of, they can stay.
Just along for the ride.
It was like, it's a coalition, but they didn't want to call it that. But seeing that in Germany, I think the Green Party there have demonstrated the flexibility and, I guess, realism required to get themselves into power. And, the Green Party here in the UK has a lot of interesting things going on as well. But that's maybe a political trend that is also ahead of the curve and something people should bear in mind, because it's not just, they're not just going to help develop that particular green industry that we've been talking about in this podcast, but obviously the wider green energy side of things as well is very exciting. So yeah, 2 things green in this podcast, one to start and one to finish. But Sam, it's been great. I've enjoyed hosting this one. Thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll see what other ways we find to mix it up in the future. Thanks very much for now, and we'll see you next Friday. Bye.